Well, nice to meet you to start with.
Nice
And
to meet you too.
it'd be nice just to have a little bit of background. What are your activities at the moment? I've seen that you're a professor at the university, so let's just start there. Are you actively teaching at the moment?
Yeah, I am. So I teach psychotherapy. I also teach trauma studies, trauma therapy.
Hmm.
And I'm teaching both psychotherapy techniques for working with people who have trauma histories, and then also for people who have broader, other kinds of histories as well, individual treatment and family and that sort of thing. And so
Hmm.
that's primarily what I do. And
Okay.
then I also write and do research on trauma.
Okay. Interesting. And the students, what is their age?
Uh, they're usually in their mid-20s. I also have an online magazine which is called the Trauma and Mental Health Report, and it's a magazine specifically focused on working with people who have trauma histories, not necessarily just psychotherapy, but even for people who themselves either have trauma histories or they know people who do. It's a magazine written for people who aren't necessarily. It's not written in a very, very high kind of technical academic language. It's really written for the general public.
Okay.
So I have a team of students and we work on that together, and that's a lot of fun actually.
Right.
Yeah,
Interesting. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a need for that to have more layman approach to trauma that the general public can understand also what
absolutely.
goes on. And I think that's missing still. So yeah, great to hear that you're kind of adding that to the field.
Thanks, Roland.
And the students that you work with, how do they receive your approach and kind of psychotherapy on the whole? Because from what I know of is that there's not a lot of teaching directly of psychotherapy in classes. I mean, there's general psychology, but I haven't heard psychotherapy being taught at school.
Well, I mean, I do a lot of clinical supervision. So even though so when I say it's a teaching, it's a lot of supervision. So I have students who themselves are doing treatment, and I supervise their work. We either look at their videos, or we also um, discuss the cases as they bring them to me. And we also have a group supervision process where students come together as a group and we all kind of review their cases that they're seeing at their different clinical sites. So it's a lot of individual and group supervision of their cases. That's what a lot of the teaching is actually.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
not so much lecture style. A little bit of that,
Okay.
but not so much.
Sounds refreshing overall,
Yeah.
just to interact with
Yeah.
youngsters. Yeah. Nice. Good. And you're also in private practice?
I am. I'm in private practice, and I see patients. It's almost entirely trauma therapy. So working with people who either dissociate or have post-traumatic stress disorder, or individuals who have complex PTSD. So people have different kinds of presentations of their traumatic past. Also people who grieve losses and are struggling with the grief because they're kind of experiencing a complicated grief. In other words, it's hard for them to say goodbye, in a sense, emotionally, to the person who has either died or left them or abandoned them, because they still have all these feelings that are associated with their relationship with that person, from when they were alive or from when they were in some sort of interaction with them. And so they feel either guilt or shame or other kinds of difficulties. And because they have trouble, they have unfinished business, as it were.
Hmm.
And so because of that, it's difficult for them to actually grieve the loss. So that's also another area of my practice, is complicated grieving. But that's also in many ways associated with trauma as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, I
Yeah,
would say it's a key component of coming back to integration, regulation.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Good. And you work with families or individuals? What's your main kind of approach?
It's mostly individual. So mostly I do individual. It's attachment focused, psychodynamic, and relational. So what does that mean? I mean, It's kind of from the relational psychodynamic school, meaning we look at the person's patterns of relationships in the here and now, how those relate to patterns that they learned from when they were younger, and then also how they manifest themselves in the actual psychotherapy relationship with me. And so looking at what happens between the two of us and how those patterns, themes, emotions relate to themes and emotions that come up in their outside life. So it's kind of it's what would be referred to as relational psychodynamic. And then also there's a strong attachment focus. So we look at their attachment patterns from childhood, how those get manifested in their everyday life. It's also trauma informed, meaning that we look at the ways in which trauma has affected them. We look at safety in their relationships, how they have trouble regulating their emotions when they feel unsafe, and then also the difficult, painful experiences that they've had a hard time talking about, and those are the traumatic experiences. So it's all of that kind of work. That's primarily what I do in therapy.
Right. Yeah, the different layers that you have to kind of work through.
Yeah, and it's mostly individual, but also with sometimes with couples. Like I'm working with a couple now, both of whom have a trauma history, so it makes it difficult for them in their relationships, in in their intimacy, because there's a lot of vulnerability that goes with sexual intimacy, and so these people have a lot of difficulty with that vulnerability. They also have difficulty with the whole issue of thinking about becoming parents is challenging for them, because again, a lot of vulnerability goes with parenting, a lot of anxiety. Am I gonna, the fear is, am I gonna mess my children up the way my parents, affected me? And so there's that sort of feeling of, well, how, what choices do you make in your life, and can you make in your life around relationships? And so that kind of work is a lot of what we do.
Okay.
So yes, both individual and couples as well. Sometimes some family work as well. Mostly individual work, I guess. I would say vast majority. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks for elaborating a little bit there.
Sure.
Yeah. Which brings us a little bit to kind of the books that you wrote, which I find the titles quite intriguing, quite interesting.
Okay.
And your first book, Trauma and the Avoidant Client. And it seems like your second book is related to that first book. Trauma and the Struggle to Open Up from Avoidance to Recovery and Growth, if I say that correctly.
Yeah.
So my first question, why the avoidant client? And I was thinking it over myself, how that might have kind of related to your personal history, if any.
Yeah. So I elaborate a little bit on my personal history actually in my second book, Trauma and the Struggle to Open Up. And a lot of people have a lot of difficulty being able to find a way to talk about their painful past. And primarily, this is because of a pattern of self-protection. Both protection of themselves from painful feelings that relate to their past, because many of the feelings are in fact overwhelming and can lead to traumatic reemergence of painful memories and flashbacks. But also they protect their relationships. So they're protecting their relationships with their loved ones. Talking about people in a negative way can feel like they're complaining. They can feel like that they don't deserve to be heard. They can feel that they're being disloyal to people that they care about. They can feel like they're breaking family secrets. And if that happens, if they feel that they're violating a family secret, that can feel like they're really being disloyal family members, and that they're not being appreciative of whatever love they did get, let's say. And so this ends up making it very, very challenging for people to be able to feel that they can actually talk about their pains and their losses and their struggles in an honest way. And so that's where that idea comes from. That avoidance can be a really self-protective, I call it self-deception in my second book, where very often people deceive themselves. And again, I'm not trying to be critical of them. I think people do this as a way of surviving. You know, when you come from a home where you have to pretend and have to act as if something's okay when it isn't, because otherwise you'd be feeling like things are almost never okay. And you know, how do you go through life every day doing that? So people have to tell themselves stories that aren't true, have to pretend. These are coping strategies. But then as they get older, these coping strategies no longer work. And they no longer work when they're looking to create the foundation for a good, honest relationship. You know, I sometimes have people say, my girlfriend tells me that I need to come in for help because I just don't talk about anything. And, there's some truth to that. They sometimes have difficulty when they have to face new developmental tasks, like, getting married, let's say, or committing in a relationship, or having children. Because again, oh my gosh, how am I going to do this? It's an overwhelming new change. And so, or medical illnesses or losses, all of these things then lead people to no longer feel like like those old coping strategies work anymore. And that's why they come in for therapy, because the old ways of coping just aren't working. Drinking, let's say, isn't working anymore, or various other coping strategies that people have used to manage with their pain. So that's sort of it in a nutshell.
Okay. How would you get started with a new client in your practice that is really kind of the avoidant attachment type or style?
Well, you meet the client where they're at. It's very, very important to start by asking people what their motivation for change is. What is it that grabs them? What is it that, what is it that's troubling them? What is it that they're suffering with? Now, this may not be simple to find out because, yes, there are some clients who come in and just start talking. It's like, it's like you press play on a tape recorder and boom, they're off and they're just going and going and going. Some clients are like that, but many people are not. Many people really aren't like that. They come in and they just know something's wrong. Things just aren't working. They're getting upset for no reason. People are being, they feel mistreated by other people, and they don't really have a good sense of what's going on. And so figuring out what is it that they're struggling with, that can take some time. But that is the key, is actually figuring out with them, to start with, what is it that they're suffering with? What change do they imagine? What about them? How would they like to see themselves different at the end of therapy? Can you get concrete with them? Walk me through a day. What would it look like? What would you wear? What would you be eating? Walk me through a day where there's this change that you imagine. What does it look like? And then as you get more specific, is this a more relational change? Is this more a self-esteem change? Then you can start seeing these other themes. And then these trauma themes will start to come out. Very often people don't come in saying, hey, I have a trauma history, this happened or that happened. Sure, they might do that if it was like a natural disaster or something like that. But if it's something like a relationship trauma, sometimes, I've had people who have been raped and they don't tell me this until the third or fourth session because they didn't think it was important. And it's like, well, yeah, gosh, that's pretty important. But to them, they don't actually know what's wrong. So figuring out where their pain is part of the struggle. In therapy, part of the challenge. It's not, if you're looking for this as a therapist, helping them disentangle how do they want to see themselves different at the end of this process. That's really important. And then helping connect those to trauma themes. If there are traumas there, obviously you're not looking for traumas if they aren't there. But if there are implications and somebody mentions something that relates to a domestic assault, and then you start unpacking that a little bit, and you see that there's guilt associated with that, and there's low self-esteem associated with it, and self-blame. Oh yeah, he hit me. Well, I kind of deserved it, the person might say. And so then you start to infer, okay, what other low self-esteem issues does this person have? And you start tracking it through their life. How has self-esteem been a theme, and low self-esteem has been a theme in this person's life, or self-blame. And you start finding these themes with them. And working through there. And that's a trauma-informed way to work. You're looking at how does the trauma inform themes about this person's life. But then you're also working in a way psychodynamically, trying to understand the patterns that have been affecting them through their lives. That's how I would start with someone with an apparently avoidant history. And yet they've suffered with something.
Right.
People come into therapy because they've suffered in some way. I mean, almost all people aren't just coming in to chit chat. I mean,
Of course.
People are coming in because they've suffered and they don't know what to do about it.
Okay. Well, thanks for that explanation.
Sure.
It's really a multi-dimensional approach, and I resonate with that. Yeah. But just to elaborate on that, why the avoidance style? Why? If I remember correctly, there's 4 different styles: the avoidant, disorganized, ambivalent, and the secure attachment style.
Yes.
What made you focus on the avoidant attachment style?
So in my first book, Trauma and the Avoidant Client, I did. In my second book, Trauma and the Struggle to Open Up, I look at all the different attachment styles.
Okay.
But I was interested in avoidant attachment to begin with because there actually isn't a lot out there about this. There just isn't a lot. There are other texts that do focus on trauma work in a general way. But I wrote Trauma and the Avoidant Client because there's just not a lot out there. People don't have a lot of strategies for helping people who are reluctant. In some literature, you might say resistant, therapy resistant. And the term resistance is a term that is used best when we think of it as in this kind of way, that people come in for therapy with mixed feelings. They're ambivalent. There's a part of them that wants to change. There's a part of them that imagines a better future for themselves. There's a part of them, as John Bowlby said, the father of attachment theory, a part of them that yearns to be able to feel better, to be understood. But there's also a part that's really afraid, and that fear really holds people back. And so if you're working with someone who is presenting with all these problems, but keeps telling you why, what you're saying is wrong, and no, everything's fine, and they don't need to change. And then the question is, why do they keep coming into your office week after week to tell you that they don't need therapy? Why is that person spending this money and time and effort? There must be a part of them that recognizes, even though consciously, absolutely, they may be telling you all the different reasons that therapy is the worst, and they're never going to get better, and you don't know what you're talking about, and all that stuff. They lead with kind of, they put their fists, in English we'd say, they put their dukes up, that's how they lead. But there's a part of them underneath that's yearning to change. So if you can find that vulnerable part, if you can sit with them and listen for the vulnerability and the hurt, and don't be obvious about it. I see it. That's vulnerability. Because they'll say, no, I'm not. Of course, they're going to fight you, right? That's what they've learned to do, to fight, to be fighters. And you know what? Fighting has worked well. Fighting has been a good strategy for them. So you don't actually want to take away their fighting spirit. That's okay. Fighting's great. I'm all for it. No problem. But you also want to help them find other parts of self as well, in addition to the fighting side. There's very likely a part of them that is suffering and yearning and vulnerable and hurt. And finding subtle ways to work with them, to be able to listen to signs that part seeks expression, and listen for that part and be open to it and hear it when it comes up. And so sometimes these things come up in fragmented ways. The person is talking about something and then they drop a little comment. Like I have an example in my second book, Trauma and the Struggle to Open Up, of a fellow who comes in and talks and tells me this funny story about how his mother, before he was born, early circumstances. I asked him some question about his early life. He says, well, he tells me about his early, I'll take you right back. My mother tried to abort me. Oh, the story's very, very funny. We became very good friends later on. And he tells me this whole story about how his mother tried to abort him. Now, he tells it as a funny story, but the story itself, if you read it in my book, it's a very sad story. I mean, there's nothing funny about it. And so what's interesting is he tells it. He could have told me any story. He didn't have to tell me that story, but that's the story he chooses to tell. Why? Because unconsciously, there's a part of him that's reaching out and saying, why did my mother have to tell me this story? Why did my mother have to tell me that I was never wanted? Why? And again, that's unconscious. That he's not telling me that in any obvious way. It's underneath the surface. So you have to listen for it, notice it. And again, I wasn't obvious. I just filed that away. I just paid attention to it. And in a later session where other themes that were similar came up, themes of rejection or somebody at work who didn't care about him or something like that, when other similar emotional themes come up, I bring back the trauma fragments and I ask about it. And he may in that moment say, oh, no, that's a totally different thing. No, that was funny when that happened. But I've brought it now into the room. And what happens is as you start to bring these trauma fragments that just get dropped along the way back into the room, they start to create these themes for people, or they start to create the themes. I'm not doing it. They start to do it. And they start coming up with things that you didn't really see before. And they might even say, oh, you asked me about that. And then they bring in some little element of it that has to do with something that hurt or something they were angry at. Often people who have a more avoidant history may not start with hurt. They may start with, that really pissed me off, because it's an easier emotion to connect to. But underneath the anger are other more vulnerable feelings. They're just a hop, skip, and a jump away. And you can get to them if you're listening for it, and
Okay.
you're curious about it. So that's, I talk about that a lot in the second book. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Listening to you, I can kind of see the complexity of unraveling people's stories and starting to connect the dots, and also kind of bring that back home for your client as to how things are related there, what I call the coping emotion and their suppressed core emotions, and kind of then the different life stories, and slowly on mapping it out, first mapping it out cognitively, but also then entering into the history somatically or in terms of feeling to
Absolutely.
kind of really processing and integrating and transforming those parts that are left behind, if I can say it like that.
That's right. That's right. They're just under the surface, or they're left behind, or they're whatever metaphor you want to use.
Yeah.
You're helping people find these aspects of themselves that,
Yeah,
exactly
great.
what you say,
Yeah. Could you elaborate a little bit on the different attachment styles? Because as a practitioner, I've heard about them. I've studied also Bowlby. I read about it, but for the general public, it's not so well known and very often not even considered as trauma or kind of forgotten.
Yeah. So in terms of attachment, John Bowlby didn't talk about these styles in such a discrete way, but later writers took his work and sort of then developed these attachment patterns that they talked about. And these attachment patterns have been studied a lot in research. There's very good evidence that people do have these characteristic ways of relating. So let me just say, attachment is our way of relating emotionally and connecting to other people. These are our patterns of relating to others. And they're based on our early experiences, especially during times of threat or danger. What did we do if we felt, think about the child who falls off their bicycle and their mother or father is with them. That child falls down, hurts themselves, so there's threat or danger. Let's say it's a 6-year-old child, and they look up at the parent. John Bowlby would say, they're giving the parent an attachment signal. It's as if they're saying, I need something. Now, how does the parent respond? Does the parent walk over and say, and not touch the child and say, all right, Timothy, you can get yourself up, dust yourself off, you'll be fine, even though Timothy's bleeding a little bit? And there's no touch, no interaction, suppression of any emotion. And then Timothy, holds back his tears, chokes it back, and then kind of, mans up, as we would say. Is that what's happening? That kind of child is turning their attention away from their attachment system, from their need for support and connection and emotion regulation when they're in distress. They're turning their attention away from it. They're turning toward the cognitive, away from all emotion. That would be an example of the development of avoidant attachment. That, you'd see that kind of thing many, many times in big ways and in little ways. All kinds of suppression of emotional vulnerability you'd see. You might see in contrast in that situation the child who can't be soothed. The parent holds the child and the child cannot be soothed. And the mother, let's say, or the father comes in and goes, oh my God, you fell off your bicycle, and then starts crying even more than the child is crying. And there's kind of role reversal. And the child says, it's okay, Daddy, I'll be fine, I'm all right. And there's kind of the child is now, the parent is not really able to be there for the child, and there's role reversal in those situations. When those kids grow up, what you see sometimes is a tendency for them to be preoccupied by their attachment hurts, to remain very angry at their parent. That attachment style is called the preoccupied attachment style, where the individual remains preoccupied through their life by their attachment hurts and really has a hard time dislodging from that. And they're often focused on their hurts to the extent that it really gets in the way of their lives. That's a second attachment style. A third attachment style is and both of those are insecure. Both of those, I'll talk about secure at the end. And then both of those are insecure. Another, and the most problematic of the insecure attachment styles, is the unresolved due to trauma. You can have trauma even when kids have avoidant attachment or preoccupied attachment. Absolutely, we see trauma, and we do, and there are. The most problematic in terms of psychopathology, in terms of people having psychological problems, through their lives, is the unresolved or what's called in the child literature disorganized attachment. And in that situation, if it's the child on the bicycle, they make movements toward the parent, they pull away from the parent, they don't have a coherent way of being able to deal with this pain. They don't know what to do, and so that's why it's called disorganized. They don't have an organized way of dealing with their attachment hurt, and the parent often has is themselves has a significant amount of psychopathology. So the parent may have a personality disorder or may not be able to be there for the child. There is no ability to help the child re-regulate their emotions. And so the child becomes dysregulated and doesn't know what to do. The parent may get angry at the child. Then the parent may say, why are you afraid of me? And then hold the child close, but then the child was just angry at the child, so the child pulls away. And the child says, and the parent says, you're always pulling away from me. So there's kind of this inability to connect, and it's quite striking when you see this in parent-child relationships. It's quite problematic, and you can see how children like this grow up to have quite a significant amount of depression and anxiety and other kinds of challenges, mental health challenges. So Now, I'll talk about the fourth attachment style, which is the secure attachment style. Now, I will say to you, 2/3 of normal households, or two-thirds of, in the general population, households, have the secure attachment style. So even though I've talked about all the different, or the three different major patterns of insecure attachment, they are actually more the exception than the rule, because, I mean, 2/3 of the population is what would be considered to be psychologically, relatively healthy, and you have the secure attachment. That doesn't mean that they don't have problems. That doesn't mean they don't struggle with depression. You can have a secure attachment style, but it does mean that if you have a secure attachment style, you're much more likely to improve with therapy more quickly. That's all. It's a faster process treatment. And with the secure attachment style, what you have is the individual, as an adult, as a child, the parent is able to, in the bicycle example, the parent is able to, this is not perfect. The parent does not need to be perfect to help a child be secure. But the parent comes over, maybe touches the child child cries a little bit, and the parent doesn't reject the emotion. The parent sort of, pulls the child in, the child cries for a bit, the parent says, oh, let me take a look at that. All right, let's get a Band-Aid on that. And the child cries a little more, and the parent says, well, come on, let's go. You'll be okay, and puts their arm around the child, touches the child, and the child quickly re-regulates their emotions. There's affect regulation. So within a very short period of time, the child can cry, does cry, but then within a relatively short period of time, re-regulates. And between the parent and child, it feels okay. There's a kind of a mutuality. In that kind of situation, the tendency as adults is to have more emotional balance. And I give an example of this in Trauma and the Struggle to Open Up, of what somebody looks like who has suffered in life, but does have some of this emotional balance. They're able to regulate their emotions relatively quickly. And this, again, doesn't mean that they haven't suffered. Doesn't mean they don't have problems. But it does mean that they're much more quickly receptive to psychotherapy.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a bit of in a nutshell, the four big attachment styles, as we can say. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess the example with the bicycle really helped to get that clear.
Yeah, it's you see it all the time. If you go to a playground, you see this kind of thing. You see attachment behavior and responses between parents and children that illustrate this.
Right. In a client-therapist relationship, how would you consider the regulation part that a therapist perhaps also does in rewiring some of those patterns or the hurt parts of clients? Could you?
Excellent question. So it's in the therapy relationship. What you want to do, so I really talk about this, I unpack this in chapter 8 in Trauma and the Struggle to Open Up, which is the question of, what happens in vivo, in the actual relationship between the client and the therapist. When the client, what happens when the client gets angry at you? What happens when the client feels disappointed in you? What happens when you show up 10 minutes late? Because we're human. We've been working with someone for a few months. The subway was slow, and we got in a little bit late. And how does the person react? Does the person hold it in and become passive-aggressive through the session and not say very much? Do they get angry at you? Do they just quietly have a theme of talking about all the people in their lives who keep disappointing them? What comes up? And you wonder to yourself, what's going on here between me and the client? If you can start using those moments between therapist and client, those micro conflicts that occur. Sometimes they're subtle, but if you pay attention as a therapist and you listen to them and you ask the client, what's going on here? I'm noticing that you're such and such. You're talking a lot about thus and so. I'm wondering if you're feeling something toward me today about XYZ? And the person's, oh no, well, I mean, you were 10 minutes late, but I know that you have to come late sometimes. I mean, it's not your fault, and they start making excuses for you like they do for every other person in their life who hurts them. Constantly making excuses for everybody else as if they don't deserve to have the right to be irritated with people or whatever. I mean, that's just one example, but there's so many different ways that these things happen depending on the person and their pattern of dealing with conflict. So noticing what happens between us and being curious about it and wondering with them, what's going on here? What are you feeling? And having them imagine what's going on for them, having you're imagining what's going on for them, playing it out, working with them a little bit, and unpacking that is so helpful with people. And so that's where I see it is really helpful if you can use the here and now of the relationship. And that means being open to whatever comes up. I mean, I gave you a particular specific example of the therapist coming late and that sort of thing, but there's so many examples of this kind of thing. And if you're paying attention to the relationship between therapist and client that starts to develop, it can be very powerful. I mean, little things like one client of mine who, after a few weeks of working, fourth session, she came in and sat on the floor. She sat on the floor. And so not a big deal. People can sit on the floor if they want to sit on the floor. But that was interesting. And I sort of stood there for a moment. I said to myself, I use this technique, which is reading your thought bubble. So, you have a thought bubble and you just sort of read it. So, so here I am. So you're sitting on the floor. I'm standing here. I'm wondering to myself, do I sit on the floor with you or do I sit in a chair? I just sort of say that. I'm just kind of reading my thought bubble. And then I just let the client respond. So what I'm doing is Peter Fonagy would say, I'm mentalizing my experience. I'm wondering aloud about my own, it's not quite mentalizing. I mean, I can go to the next step, which is mentalizing and saying, I'm wondering what it would mean if I did such and such, or like wondering about your motivations, that sort of thing. But it's a sort of a self-reflective task that I use with people. And so she said to me, you don't want to sit on the floor with me, it's dirty. That's what she said to me. And I said, how do you know what I want to do? And she said, well, I just assume, you're a therapist, you're dressed in a nice clothing. Why would you want to get yourself dirty? And I said, I don't know. I'm not sure. Why wouldn't I? And so she kind of wondered about this a little bit. And so we talked for a moment there. And I said, I'm going to just try something. I'm going to sit on the floor and let's just see how it feels for you. I'm going to sit here on the floor with, and so we sort of sat across each other. I was on the floor, she was, and I was just saying, just try this out. This may not be okay. It may be okay. You let me know how it feels. And so I sat down, we sat there and we talked a little bit and I checked in with her and it turned out that is actually what she wanted me to do. She wanted to sit on the floor. And I won't go into what exactly that meant to her because it had all kinds of rich symbolic meaning and all kinds of other things. And so I won't go into that. But the relationship piece is the piece I wanted to point out there is I just sort of sat with, what does it mean between the two of us if I do this? And, it turned out for her, she had very few people ever as a kid. No one sat on the floor and played with her. I mean, I'm not saying that was the whole thing, but that was a piece of it. This was a person who never had a feeling of anybody sitting on the floor with her. She felt very lonely as a child. So being there with me, now I'm not going to say that I'm going to sit on the floor with her every single session. I'll see kind of where she goes with it. We don't always, that's not the main issue here. The issue is, where does the relationship come in with clients and paying really close attention to how the therapist-client relationship gets manifested in the sessions. That's really important in therapy.
Yeah, and keep providing space and safety and kind of an invitation to regulation.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Would you, considering the avoidant client, if you advise kind of a key key point to other therapists or helpers, counselors, what would you want to bring across?
Well, I would say with avoidant clients, I would say taking it slowly in therapy for therapists. It's very, very easy to get frustrated. And so, excuse me, pay close attention to your countertransference. Are you getting frustrated because this is kind of rescue fantasy where you feel, in trauma work, we often have these rescue fantasies where I'm gonna save this person from
Yeah,
their
savior syndrome is what I call it. Yeah,
savior syndrome. You can call it that. Absolutely. And so then you get frustrated. This person's not cooperating. They're not getting better. And well, you have to sort of pay attention to, is getting them better fast their agenda, your agenda? Now it may be complicated because they may be also complaining, why aren't I getting better faster? So I understand there's pressure. I do understand that. But that's a big piece. Another piece with clients who have an avoidant attachment in particular is letting them do the work. So you ask them a question and they shrug their shoulders and they say, I don't know, as if to say to you, I'm not going to answer your question. Ask me another question. And then you come up with another question. Nope, don't do that. Don't come up with another question. Instead, what you want to do is help them sit there with it. So, you say a question, you ask some sort of question, whatever it is, some sort of about a relationship or whatever, and the person goes, oh, I don't know. And then you say, give it a moment, Kyle, and just think about it. I'm sure you'll come up with something. And just sit in silence for a moment. Now, I'm not going to sit in silence for 2 hours, but give it a moment and let the person kind of have a little bit of anxiety because they're going to feel anxious and see what happens. Maybe, as often does happen, they then start to wrestle with it. Or maybe they'll just say, I just don't know. Okay, all right. Well, sometimes, and then I'm not going to be, kind of force him into, but I might say, or her, I might say, sometimes we don't have the answers to some of these questions. So, but we might come back to that. And so then, but I will probably come back to that is what I will. Or I'll look for themes. I notice that very often, this is the third time in the session, Kyle, that you've said, I don't know to me. I notice that it's when I ask you about XYZ that you really have a hard time knowing. I find that really curious. And so again, kind of coming back. So it's again, not just taking the I don't knows or the, I'm going to push, not taking it so, at face value, but kind of letting them do the work. Don't take over and try to do the work for them, but let them kind of struggle with the work. Bring it back and give them the space to wrestle with it. And again, a lot of this is subtle because you don't want to do it so much that it's more than their anxiety can bear, but you also don't want to be constantly rescuing them from their own internal struggle, because therapy is a struggle. Let them struggle with it a bit, So that's something that I suggest with kind of clients. Yeah.
Okay.
Also, noticing resistance, paying attention to the part of them that wants to change and the part of them that wants to stay the same. You're always looking at, sort of, these are some motivational interviewing strategies, but looking at what is it about them, what's in it for them to change? What's the payoff for them to actually change? We know there's a payoff to keep things as they are. It's easy. It's, we also know that there's a disadvantage to keeping things as they are. And that is that if they keep things as they are, well, maybe they're going to lose their job, or maybe their wife will leave them, or husband will leave them, or maybe their children are going to end up messed up in their fantasies or their worries. So there can be motivation for change as well. And so you want to help them connect to that motivation for change. Those are some techniques that I do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I talk about that. I talk about specific strategies in trauma in the avoidant client around working with resistance and clients who have those struggles. Yeah.
I'm gonna link your books below this video so people can kind of read up a bit more about you and your kind of approaches to working with the avoidant, but also the other attachment styles.
Okay.
Just kind of the last question to hit it off for today.
Yeah.
From a client perspective, if I would come to you and I have an avoidant style, just to, as we're already talking about the avoidant style,
Sure.
what would you kind of advise, or kind of a key crucial point that you could give away
For clients who have this
exactly
pattern? How has it gotten in the way of your life? So how has whatever it is that you're referring to here, as the person thinks about it, how has it gotten in the way, and what concretely is in it for the person to change? Because that's going to be where it's going to feel like, okay, this is worth it. So that would be, and so I talked about that a little bit before also. The other thing I would say is that therapy is not necessarily a quick process. For some people it can be, but for many people it does take time, especially if you've suffered. Especially if there's been significant pain that you've had in, whether it's a trauma like domestic violence or you have PTSD because of the military experience, or crime, something like that, or whether it's what we sometimes call small t trauma. People who have suffered chronic invalidation in their home. What used to be called conditional love, you're not okay unless you do this, and there's and very little unconditional love. People who have experienced those kind of things and invalidation, that can, or neglect, just kind of no connection to people and family members, those can be painful experiences, and people do have the right to seek help for that. And so it's really important to give yourself permission to seek help for that, not to feel like other people have suffered so much more than me. Where do I get off complaining? I mean, the reality is that if the suffering you've experienced has gotten in the way of your life, then it's getting in the way of your life, and therapy is a way to make some changes. So that's what I would say.
Okay, great. Yeah. Well, thanks so much for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge. And
oh, no problem. My pleasure, Roland.
Yeah, and hopefully we're gonna talk again, and we can delve into some new subjects, topics.